Ryan Kurzak here of Vedic Astrology. And today we're going to take a look at how to predict with the Dashas, how to look at future trends and see how the life might go. Now with Dashas, the first thing you have to be able to do is read the birth chart, because the Dashas essentially are just showing when the seeds are going to sprout within a person's life, the seeds of their karma, and when those fruits of karma are going to ripen and come to pass. And the reason we have to learn to read the birth chart first is because it's within this birth chart here that all of those potentials, all of those indications are outlined. And this is why in the current class we're doing, the current online class we're doing, I've spent 9 months working with these students to figure out how to understand the birth chart. And we haven't even talked about dashas yet, because if you don't know that, then dashas are just sort of a waste of time, and they'll just make you more confused. The chart we're going to use today is a really great chart because it's a chart of a person who was recently in a car accident, and all the dashas line up very perfectly to illustrate this point, so it's a really good teaching example. Now, in order to read the dashas, the first thing you need to be able to do is understand what's going on with the Mahadasha Lord. So if we see here, this person's in a Saturn Mahadasha. So everything dealing with Saturn is going to be a ground influence or an umbrella of the experiences that this person's going to potentially move through within their life. And Saturn ruling the second house, Saturn ruling the third house. Number one, there's going to be a strong emphasis on finances. Saturn's in the 12th, and Saturn's in a neutral dignity. So the finances are going to be average, but there's going to be more potential towards loss within their finances. Why? Because that we have the ruler of the second, which is finances, within the 12th, which is the house of loss. Next, we see that Saturn rules the third house, which is the house of short distance travels. So this person's going to be moving around and traveling a lot. And they've been doing this, number one, for their hobbies, which is another third house influence. Number two, for their work. However, this is going to show losses due to one's hobbies and losses due to short distance travels. So there's going to be lots of expenses on those things because we have here the ruler of the third within the 12th. So that's an underlying general idea of things that you can see from a Mahadasha Lord period. And it'll be different for everyone's chart because everyone's not going to be in the same Mahadasha, obviously. Now, the tricky part comes when we are going into these subcycles. And so if you look down here, we've got 1, 2, 3, 3 additional planets we need to consider. And this actually goes down to 5 levels, but for this particular example, we don't need to do that. And you're going to have big experiences occur in your life or in your client's life when all of these planets point to the same thing. So what I mean by that is if you want to do something and you have 3 different things you want to do in your mind, you want to go play violin, you want to go out to eat, or you want to go meditate. Those are 3 different things. And they're not pointing in the same direction. So when you have 3 different things in your mind, you're still sitting there contemplating, trying to figure it out. So you don't actually do anything. Now, the second that one of those switches over to, say, 2 instances of playing violin, you're more likely to move in that direction. When all 3 of the thoughts within your mind are pointing towards practicing the violin, you're more likely to get up and go practice it because you don't have to think about it anymore. It's the same way with the dashas. You have to see what these planets represent, and if they represent the same thing, or if they're doing the same thing, that will give a big event within a person's life. If they don't, the person's pretty much just going to keep doing what they've been doing because there's no confluence, there's no synergy going in the same direction. Now, for this person's chart, let's take a look here. We have a Pisces ascendant. We've already talked about what Saturn ruling the second and third means within the 12th house. So we need to look at their next period lord, their sub-period. And what we are looking at here is Venus. And so we see that Venus and Saturn are together in the 12th house. So already we know that there's going to be more expenses going out within this time period, particularly Saturn and Venus, because that 12th house is getting powerfully activated. Now, Venus rules from the ascendant, the 6th house, and the 11th house. The 11th house is a social house. that gets us involved in social involvements. And the 6th house is a house of personal improvement, but also injury, illness, and accident. And that goes with Saturn here into the 12th. So this is going to start bringing in some more of these expenses, these ideas around expenses. And Venus happens to be a planet that, as its natural Karaka ship, is a planet of vehicles. So we're going to have some sort of loss through vehicles. And Saturn with Venus, Saturn's the planet of loss and also poverty and hardship. These two planets together in the 12th are going to give, again, loss through some sort of vehicular experience. Now, once we do that, we need to then look at, let's see here, the next level. And the thing about dashas is you want to see what are the planets doing from the lagna, from the ascendant, but to get really precise, good information, you also want to look at what are the planets doing from the previous the previous level's lord. So if we're going from, we went from Saturn to Venus, now we need to go from Venus back to Saturn. So from Venus, treating that as the lagna, we see that Saturn rules the 3rd and the 4th house. It's Saturn as well, and it's with Venus here. So now we again have a 3rd house confluence. Remember that from the very beginning when we were talking about Saturn ruling the 3rd from the ascendant? Well, Saturn also rules the 3rd from Venus. Saturn rules the 4th from Venus, which is a sign that can deal with vehicles. So now we have more confluence towards vehicles. We know that Saturn is starving Venus here, so somehow the vehicles are going to be getting starved, causing some sort of suffering or a problem there. And let's see here, let me check my notes. Yes, so next we want to look at Saturn, from Saturn to Mars, because we're going Saturn to Venus, Venus to Saturn, and then Saturn to Mars. So from Saturn, Mars is in the 3rd house. More 3rd house influence here, more short distance travel influence here. Mars is a natural karaka of injury and accident, sudden things happening. From Saturn, Mars rules the 6th and the 12th house. Again, a house of injury and accident and illness. And the 12th house, a house of loss and expenses. So what we see here is we have all of this 3rd, 6th, 12th, 4th house influences coming together all at once. And in this chart, I believe it was just a few days ago. Yeah, so it was during this September 14th to September 24th period, Saturn, Venus, Saturn, Mars period. This person was in a car accident. This person was hospitalized, was injured, and couldn't drive home. The car was totaled. Why? Because each of these things, both innately of their own nature, but also based on where they were placed from each other, came together and created a pattern, multiple patterns coming together, which resulted in that event. And that's the way it goes for any event within a person's life. The more confluence, the more times you see these things happening, both naturally from the ascendant within the birth chart, also from each planet and the sub-period lords, that's going to show a time when something's going to happen in regards to whatever area of life you're looking at. For example, I'm not going to pull up a different chart, but let's say that we were talking about a person's career. And let's say that there was Jupiter, they were running a Jupiter cycle, and Jupiter was in their 10th house. And Jupiter was the 9th house lord. So this is naturally going to get them involved in a career dealing with teaching. Let's say that the ruler of the 1st was also in the 9th, which is getting the body, the personality involved in education and teaching. And now they're in a period lord where the 10th house is activated, showing teaching. They're in a period lord where the 1st house lord is in the 9th, showing a direction towards teaching and education. And we can keep going down until we see them all line up. And when they all line up, that's when the person's going to be very strongly engaged in, say, a career of teaching. So this is one of the ways that you can start looking at the dashas to get a sense of what's going to happen. And it's tedious, and it takes a lot of consideration because there's a lot of things to look at. It's not hard, it's just tedious because you have to keep doing the same things over and over and over again, which means you have to take notes. When I'm doing someone's dashas and I'm really looking intently at their dashas, I start with the dasha lord. I say, what does that mean? What does that mean within their birth chart? I take about a paragraph or two of notes. Then I look at the sub-cycle lord. I say, what does that mean? If there's some kind of confluence there, meaning that they're pointing in the same direction, then I'll say, okay, that's good. So then I go down to the next period lord. I say, all right, what does that planet mean within the person's birth chart? If it doesn't add up, then I stop there. I say, well, you might go in this direction, but it's not that strong. If I see that that period lord is also pointing in the same direction, representing the same things, I keep going. Until eventually I see just how often does a particular indication arise. If it arises 75% of the time throughout all of the Mahadasha, Subdasha lords, then I make a prediction. If it doesn't, I stop and I start over, and I wait until I see when there's a particular planetary period happening. Now with this chart, you also have to look at the transits, because the transits, what they do is they show when something's going to be triggered. We call them trigger transits. And so she was in a right period. She was in a Saturn, Venus, Saturn, Mars period, which was right for it. And then what we also see is by transit, her Saturn, her Venus, and this Rahu were all coming together in that 12th house, which in her birth chart lines up perfectly. And it was within 1 degree. All of these happened within 1 degree of each other. So Saturn was at, say, 9 degrees, Venus was at 9 degrees, Ketu, Rahu was at 8 degrees in the sky by transit, and it was within 1 degree, within the same Navamsha of her natal Saturn. So we need to look at the dashas, but to make a very distinct prediction, we need to see when are the transits going to trigger them. And once we get all of that line together, you can make you've got a pretty good case for whatever it is that you're seeing within the person's chart. Otherwise, just consider it like trends. If someone says, I'd like to do this, is this a good time to do it? Go through the dashas, see if they point in that direction. If so, say yes, you might as well try, because you might be successful. If they're saying, I want to start a business, and you look at their dashas and they're in a 12th house period and an 8th house period, say Mahadasha Lord is 12th Lord, then the Subdasha Lord is the 8th, and the next period down is the 3rd. Well, those are all indications for loss and not really getting very far, and with the 3rd getting involved, it'd be too much self-effort, so they wouldn't be able to achieve. So that's one way that you can use the dashas, just to get some general sense of when someone asks you a question of whether something is good or bad, or if it's a good time or good opportunity to do it. But anyway, go back and review this video, take some notes on how I went through that particular procedure. Hopefully I'll write something out about that soon. And that'll help give you some ideas of which way to go with the dashas. So enjoy, and talk to you soon.